Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. In the middle of February, something called the Syrian Electronic Army, hackers in Syria that support the government, hacked into Al Jazeera's servers and found some emails. Some of them were written by Ali Hashem, who was a Middle East correspondent for the Arab Al Jazeera channel. In those emails, he expressed his concern about the way Al Jazeera was covering the conflict in Syria. It later led to his resignation. Now joining us to talk about these events, his resignation, and the situation in the Middle East and media is Ali Hashem. Ali joins us from Beirut, where he's a television journalist. As I said, he worked for Al Jazeera Arabic. He's covered the conflict in Libya, Lebanese politics. He covered stories on the Syrian-Lebanese border recently. He previously worked for BBC, and before that at Manar TV in Lebanon. And as I said, he joins us from Beirut. Thanks very much, Ali.
You're welcome.
So start with what happened in February. What were these hackers, and then what happened?
Actually, in February, it seems that some hackers, the pro-regime hackers, were able to get, into the servers of Al Jazeera network, and they were able to, go into several, or let's say hundreds of email accounts of journalists and executives and whatever. So those people were able to go into our emails and see the conversations that were going through inside the channel. One of those conversations was between me and one of the Arabic channel presenters, and then we were just talking about the coverage and points regarding this coverage. We had some problems, as for me, late in before in May, I had a problem with the channel when we were on the borders with Syria, and there were a lot of armed men, militants, tens of them, and they were with weapons and just moving along the borders from Lebanon to Syria. At that time, everyone was talking about the revolution in Syria, that it's peaceful revolution, it's not using arms, but what we saw, it was really interesting, and kind of, if it was any other channel, this should be a breaking news, it should be a big story. But actually, Al Jazeera, let me say, the policy and the channel, it's not maybe the journalists inside. They went back to the owners, and then it was kind of, it's not allowed, and I was asked to go back to Beirut, and those footage weren't ever aired on Al Jazeera. And this problem, made a kind of credibility problem between me and the channel. And I tried my best to solve this issue. I tried my best to tell the my seniors, my bosses, all of them, that there is a problem and we should solve such a problem. Actually, when this happened, and I was talking about this issue with my colleague in Doha, and she's a well-known presenter over there. Actually, also she told me a lot about what she's passing by and what she's going through, and how she was, on air, and then she was asked to leave there because she asked kind of hard questions or harsh questions to the opposition members who are kind of supported by Qatar. So we were talking these issues, and then someone just popped in and took our privacy off, and just took everything and published them on air. Some were kind of on the Syrian television, some were on newspapers in Beirut and in many other Arab capitals. So this was the story at that time.
So before we go further into your own story, let's back up one step. What exactly did you see in terms of arms going into Syria? Who do you think, or were you able to tell was supplying the arms?
Actually, I can't identify who's really supplying the arms, but actually we saw armed men just crossing the river, the Great Northern River, which is the only a natural barrier between Lebanon and Syria. They were just crossing that barrier and going into Syria, and then clashing with the Syrian army. That was in May, and even something similar happened in April, but it wasn't on camera. But in May it was on camera, and we had the footage, and no one wanted to have them on air. At that time, everybody was watching. We were as journalists, myself were the only Arab news channel on the borders, and we were trying to see what's going on over there.
So you're talking almost a year ago now, then.
Yeah, that was in May. May 2011.
And I was planning actually to get into this subject a little further on, but we're here, so let's talk about it. Is it your sense that what happened in Syria that was in fact, this is what I'm getting from the people I'm talking to, that there was a real peaceful protest developing across the country. That protest was repressed by the government forcefully, but then it gets militarized, and to a large extent by forces outside Syria. The protest gets militarized. Is that scenario what seems to you to be correct?
Actually, it was clear. The protest started peacefully, but it seems that quickly it went into militarizing. Some external factors or factions, wanted the revolution to be militarized, and they wanted to face al-Assad's crackdown with weapons. And maybe this was bad for the revolution. Maybe if the revolution stayed peaceful, it might have achieved a lot. But what happened is that I'm not sourcing or quoting. I just saw with my eyes, and it was in the beginning of the revolution. It was just like 1 month and a half from the revolution, and things were, I was seeing a lot of weapons, people with RPGs, people with Kalashnikovs, just crossing from the borders, and they were not one or two, they were, big number. They were just dominating the whole village that we were on the borders with. So, the militarization of the revolution started early, and maybe those who were trying maybe to push they want al-Assad to fall as soon as possible. Those wanted to say that al-Assad is facing the peaceful crackdown with weapons, while the others on the revolution side are kind of peaceful people, are not holding weapons.
And you weren't able to ascertain who those people were crossing the river, those fighters? No,
actually that was impossible. You can't ask, who are those people, because, you are just seeing armed men, and, we were just beside them. So it was clear that those people are fighting for the Syrian revolution. But who are they? Some of them were Lebanese, some of them were Syrians. But, you can, at that time it wasn't clear. There were no umbrella they were fighting under, After like 6 or 7 months, we started hearing about the Free Syrian Army, but at that time we didn't hear about anyone. It was just like, those are armed men just crossing the borders and fighting against al-Assad's army. But it wasn't clear who are they and who are they backed by, who is giving them the weapons, who is really pushing them to do this and that.
Now, so in terms of your email correspondence and your concerns, what was it about the coverage that you didn't find legitimate? Or, you'd say this story wasn't covered, the crossing of the river by these fighters, but what about the rest of the coverage of Syria?
Actually, this was the main issue that I had, a problem with, because it's really a problem of credibility. Whenever you have your own footage and you are your channel's eyes in that area, and the channel is refusing to air such pictures, then you should have some question marks. You should raise some question marks. I'm not coming to. I didn't come to Al Jazeera, as an amateur. I'm a professional. I used to work for the BBC before for 4 or 5 years with the BBC, and then there is a kind of things we learn over there about the credibility, about objectivity, being unbiased. I might not be supportive of the British government's doctrines or policies in the Middle East, but I respect working at that time for the BBC, because they used to respect us as journalists. The problem is when you are a journalist and you're not being respected as a journalist, and then you're asked to do something, in parallel with the agenda of the channel's owners, and this is the problem. This is the big problem that any journalist might find.
Right. Now, in one of the emails, in one of the reports I read about the emails, one of the emails says that there's this conflict for journalists between the Qatari agenda, it was described, and reporting. I mean, what is the Qatari agenda in terms of Syria?
No, actually, we didn't talk in this issue.
I'm not sure it was your email, actually. I think it might even have been referenced to someone
else's.
else's.
I can tell you one thing. You know, there is no government. There is no governments are not charities. You know, so whenever a government is paying for a channel, at the end, I respect all my colleagues at Al Jazeera. They're all good journalists, professionals, and I'm proud to work with them. But the problem, it's not in the journalists, it's not in even the executives in the Al Jazeera. It's not a problem with Al Jazeera. It's the problem with those who are really financing Al Jazeera, which are the Qataris. You know, today the Qataris are kind of committing. You know, they are taking Al Jazeera to commit suicide. They're forcing Al Jazeera to commit suicide. Al Jazeera was kind of respected by everyone. Even Al Jazeera went with 2 or 3 languages, and everyone was watching Al Jazeera because they really believed that Al Jazeera is doing good journalism. Today, it's a big problem right now. Wherever you go around the Arab world, everyone is questioning the credibility of Al Jazeera. They're questioning the agenda Al Jazeera is working with or it's working for. Today, it's not anymore that Al Jazeera is doing journalism for journalism. Today, journalism is being used for politics.
And what is that politics? What does Qatar want in Syria?
Actually, it's really strange. You know that, or everyone knows also that the Qatari regime used to be one of the strongest and the closest allies of the Syrian regime. And that wasn't for 1 year or 2 years. That was for the last at least 6 years. They were really close allies. They had even, family visits between each other. Actually, things changed after the Egyptian revolution, and things started to be really strong. Really, something changed in the Qatari politics. Some will say that they had kind of a deal with the Americans in this regard. I'm not here to analyze what happened really, but it was something strange. In my resignation letter, I was telling the executives of my channel that the first 15 days of the Syrian revolution, it was like nothing was happening in Syria. Al Jazeera wasn't covering, and in case there was any kind of coverage of what's going on there, we were referring to the uprising over there. It's kind of demonstrations asking for reforms. It's the same way the pro-Assad media was dealing with the revolution. But when the bilateral relations between the Qataris and the Syrians was kind of exploded for a reason we really don't know why, things changed, and we started dealing with the revolution in Syria as the priority of the channel, and that there is no other revolution but this revolution.
And is there any evidence that you know of that would show there's something had to do with the Saudi-Qatari relations that would have changed Qatar on this? Because the Saudis seem pretty militant on Syria right from the beginning.
Actually, the thing is, as I told you, something strange happened. What really happened? What are the under table deals that were really set? No one knows. Is it something that was really prepared before, and the Qataris were just waiting for a turning point to really be so blatant and clear about their own stance from Syria? Actually, I can't say, because I'm not a political analyst. Rather, I really cared for one thing: doing real journalism. I really don't really care about politics and who's with who, because my job as a journalist is saying what's going on and not doing things to and making things. So my problem was really journalism. I don't have a problem because actually, as you know, maybe Qatar have good relations with Israel. Qatar have good relations with America. Qatar have good relations with Iran, and that was just 1 year ago, 1 year before the revolution. It was Qatar had good relations with everyone except for Saudi Arabia. So in a day and a night, everything changed, and now Qatar is a country with enemies for the first time. they were kind of doing a strategy of the zero enemies, zero problems in the region, and they were trying to show themselves as the brokers of the region, brokers of peace deals, brokers of consensuses, whatever. They solved the problem in Lebanon. They solved the problem in Yemen. They tried to solve the problem in Yemen. They tried to solve the problems in Sudan. So these people were trying to play a role, and now they changed this role.
One of the turning points seemed to be Libya, because Qatar seemed to play such a leading role in the militarization of the Libyan conflict and being very, supportive and again, leading very much the expansion of the NATO mission and turning it into regime change in Libya. Was that a sort of a change in Qatari policy? Is that where this begins?
It seems the Libyan revolution was a main turning point in the whole thing. But you never know what was going before that, because it wouldn't be that one thing just changed everything. Assad's stance from Gaddafi was kind of supportive, but will this turn the Qataris against him directly? And okay, if that's true, then they will start covering the revolution in Syria from the beginning and not waiting like 15 or 20 days to start covering this revolution. There are many stories said about Hamad bin Jassim going to Damascus and meeting al-Assad and telling him that the Qataris are ready to pay from $1 to $1 billion for reforms, and that Assad's regime have kind of surpluses against facing other regimes, whereas the regime is kind of supporting the resistance and against Israel, and this is kind of popular in the Arab world. So when Hamad when Hamad bin Jassim told him this things, then it, as I know, it might be confirmed, it might not be confirmed, but this is what is said. Then al-Assad was replied in a harsh way and asked him to leave the meeting room. And from that point, everything changed, and the Qataris decided to make al-Assad their own first enemy.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, we'll talk more about Libya, Bahrain, and Qatar, and the media in general. So please join us for the second part of our interview with Ali Hashem on the Real News Network.